On the eve of his small, hard-won wedding, a man draws a line. His charming, faithless brother isn't invited. His mother, a peacemaker who confuses secrecy with love, mounts a quiet campaign to undo it. As pressure builds, he must choose between inherited harmony and hard-earned peace. When Emma said yes to my proposal, I felt something inside me settle in a way it never had before. We had been together for almost 5 years, and by the time I slipped that ring on her finger, I was certain about her in a way I had never been certain about anyone or anything in my life. She was steady, kind, funny, and had that quiet sort of patience that could make a bad day feel manageable again. After a long stretch of strained family relationships and misplaced trust in people, I thought I knew Emma had become the calm in my life, and I wanted our wedding to reflect that calm. I wanted it simple, full of warmth, and free of old family ghosts. Unfortunately, my mother had other plans entirely. My family is complicated, not in the explosive kind of way that you see in movies, but in the slow, steady undercurrent kind of way where no one raises their voice yet everyone somehow ends up hurt. My mother hates conflict so deeply that she often creates it by trying to pretend it does not exist. She is a peacemaker in the same way a matchmaker might throw strangers together and hope something sticks. If you tell her you are angry, she will tell you to be the bigger person and forgive because family is forever. It sounds noble until you realize it means your feelings do not count if they make anyone uncomfortable. For as long as I can remember, she has been that way. I used to think it was love, but I have learned it is fear disguised as harmony. This whole situation began because of my older brother Ryan. When we were younger, we were close in the way brothers are before life begins to separate them. We played ball in the yard and shared a room until high school, when everything about us began to diverge. Ryan was the golden child, the one who always seemed to make people laugh effortlessly, who could charm teachers into second chances and walk through life with his hands in his pockets as if nothing could touch him. I admired that once. It took me years to realize that behind that charm there was a kind of selfishness that never really went away. It took what happened in college for me to finally see it clearly. I was in my junior year when it happened. I had been dating a girl named Lauren for almost 3 years. She was my first real relationship, and in those days I was all in. I thought we would probably end up together. She knew Ryan, of course everyone in my family did, and at first they seemed friendly in that casual way you expect. Until one afternoon when I got a call from a friend who told me she had seen them together in a place that made no sense. A small restaurant just off campus, the kind of place people went when they did not want to be seen. I remember laughing it off at first, thinking my friend had made a mistake. But that night I asked Lauren about it, and something in her face changed. She hesitated just long enough for the truth to crawl out between us. It had not been a one-time thing. It had been going on for months. My brother and my girlfriend, together, behind my back. I remember every detail of that night like a film that refuses to fade. The way my hands shook, the sound of my own voice as I tried to ask why. She cried and said she did not know how to explain it. But Ryan did not cry. When I confronted him later, he just looked at me like I was overreacting. He said something I still hear sometimes when I cannot sleep. He said if she was willing to cheat, maybe I was not giving her what she needed. He said it so casually that I almost believed he thought he was helping me learn something. That was the last real conversation we ever had. I walked away and never spoke to him again. My mother tried to patch it up, of course. She treated it like a small sibling squabble, like maybe Ryan had borrowed my car and forgotten to fill the tank. She said men make mistakes and brothers should not hold grudges. I tried explaining how deep that wound went, how the betrayal from 2 people I loved at once had hollowed me out in a way that took years to recover from, but she would not listen. She kept saying that family was all that mattered. So I learned to stay quiet. I stopped bringing him up and stopped attending family gatherings where he would be present. Over time, that silence became a boundary, and I started to rebuild myself piece by piece, far away from that family dynamic. Now, years later, as Emma and I were planning our wedding, I was finally beginning to feel like my life was mine again. We wanted something small, around 80 guests, just close friends and people who had been there through the rough parts. I had no plans to invite Ryan. The thought of seeing him there smiling and shaking hands as if nothing had ever happened made my stomach turn. But as soon as my mother found out about our engagement, she started pushing. She asked if Ryan would be invited the same way someone asks if the sky will be blue on a clear day. When I told her no, she froze, looked at me as though I had confessed to a crime, and said I could not possibly mean that. "He is your brother," she said, as if that answered everything. I tried to explain that some relationships do not heal just because time has passed. She did not hear a word of it. Over the next week, she called repeatedly, leaving voicemails about how I was creating unnecessary drama and how our family would look broken if Ryan was left out. The irony was so thick I almost laughed. Then the guilt texts began. Cousins saying it would mean so much to our father's memory if the family could all be together. Aunts writing that I should think of how sad our grandmother would be. It was like an organized campaign, and my mother was the strategist behind it all. I told Emma about it, and she told me to stand firm. She said if my peace mattered to me, then this was the line I had to hold. And I agreed. For a while I ignored the messages, but they kept coming until one afternoon my mother called me in tears saying she would not come to the wedding if Ryan was not invited. She said she could not take sides between her sons. I knew that was her way of taking his side without admitting it. The pain of that hit harder than I expected. I love my mother despite everything, and the idea of her not being there made my throat tighten. Still, I could not let her use that love as leverage. That night I sat at the kitchen table and drafted a letter. Not to her but to Ryan. I told him everything that had been left unsaid. How his betrayal had changed me, how the silence between us had been the only thing keeping me sane, and how this wedding was not about reconciliation but about peace. I told him I wished him well, but I did not want him there. I sent the letter the next morning and waited for the storm that I knew would follow. When his reply came, it was exactly what I expected and worse. He sent a series of short, angry texts accusing me of being immature, of holding on to the past, of trying to make our mother choose sides. He said I should have learned forgiveness by now. I read each line once and deleted it. My mother called that evening crying again, saying she could not believe I was being so cruel to my brother and that she did not recognize me anymore. I told her I was sorry she felt that way and hung up before she could start the guilt parade again. That night I sat beside Emma and tried to let it all go, but something inside me still wondered if I was doing the right thing or if I was just building another wall I would regret later. The wedding was a week away and the invitations had all been sent except one. I felt both lighter and heavier, knowing exactly what that missing name meant for the rest of my life. In the days that followed my decision, I could feel the quiet tension stretching across every corner of my family. My mother stopped calling as often, and when she did, her tone was clipped in that polite, restrained way that told me she was furious but pretending not to be. Every call seemed to circle back to Ryan. She would mention his name casually in conversation, the way someone might drop a familiar landmark into a story hoping you would stop and look at it. She said he had been asking about me and that he regretted how distant we had become. I knew what she was doing. She was laying a breadcrumb trail of guilt, hoping I would follow it. I did not. I kept my voice calm, told her I was busy with work or wedding preparations, and changed the subject whenever she steered the conversation back to him. Emma watched me go through it all with a kind of patient understanding that only comes from someone who has seen you at your lowest before. She would make us tea at night and let me talk if I wanted to, or sit in silence if I did not. I remember one evening when I told her I could not understand why my mother would risk our relationship over someone who had caused me so much pain. Emma said something that stayed with me. She said some people cling to the illusion of harmony because they are terrified of what the truth would look like if they stopped pretending. It made sense. My mother was not defending Ryan because she thought he was right. She was defending her fantasy that our family was still whole. Admitting otherwise would mean admitting she had failed to protect her children from each other. As the wedding drew closer, the pressure began to take on a new form. My mother stopped trying to persuade me directly and started recruiting help. I began receiving calls from relatives I had not heard from in years. They would start with cheerful small talk before inevitably drifting toward the same subject. They told me Ryan had been talking about how sad he was that we had grown apart and how much he wanted to be there for me on my big day. I knew they were only repeating what my mother had told them, but it still stung. The idea of him painting himself as the wounded party made my blood warm in a way I had not felt in years. I reminded myself to stay calm. Getting angry would only give them ammunition. Then came the social media messages. A cousin I barely knew posted something about how families should not let old grudges ruin happy occasions. Another aunt left a comment on one of Emma's engagement photos, saying she hoped we could all find forgiveness in time. It was astonishing how quickly private pain could become public entertainment when family was involved. I showed the posts to Emma and she shook her head and told me to let them talk. She was right, of course. The best response to noise is silence. Still, it felt strange watching my story twisted into something else in the mouths of people who knew only fragments. One evening I decided to call my mother and lay everything out clearly one last time. I told her I loved her and that nothing would ever change that, but I could not invite Ryan to the wedding. I explained that it was not about punishing him. It was about protecting myself. I told her how long it had taken me to rebuild trust in people after what he had done and how fragile that peace still felt. She listened quietly and then said something that made me realize we were speaking two different languages. She said I was letting bitterness rule my heart and that forgiveness was the only way to move on. I told her forgiveness did not mean forgetting and it did not mean pretending. It simply meant releasing the anger and walking away. She sighed and said I was being stubborn. I told her I was being healthy. We ended the call on a polite note, but I knew she was not convinced. A few days later, a package arrived at our apartment. Inside was a small box with an old photograph of Ryan and me when we were kids standing by a lake with fishing rods in our hands. Underneath the photo was a short note from my mother written in her delicate handwriting. It said, "I hope you remember how close you two once were and how much love still exists beneath the hurt." I sat there staring at that picture for a long time. We must have been 10 and 12 back then. I could see the sun reflecting off the water and the wide smiles on our faces. For a moment I did remember that time before everything fell apart. Then I folded the picture back into the box and placed it on a shelf out of sight. The past was not something I wanted to live in anymore. The next morning Emma found me at the kitchen table staring into my coffee and asked if I was all right. I told her about the photo and she said gently that memories could be both beautiful and poisonous depending on how you held them. She was right again. I decided to take the day off from work and went for a long walk through the park near our apartment. The air smelled of rain and cut grass, and for the first time in weeks I felt calm. I thought about how strange it was that my family could turn something as pure as love into a test of loyalty. I knew my mother thought I was choosing Emma over Ryan, but that was not true. I was choosing peace over pain. There was a difference. That evening my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. It said she had been thinking and she could not bring herself to attend a wedding that divided her sons. My chest tightened as I read it. I showed it to Emma, who simply squeezed my hand and said it was my decision how to respond. I sat there for a while, then typed back that I would miss her, but I understood. I told her she was always welcome if she changed her mind. I pressed send and placed the phone face down on the table. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 days later, Emma came home with a strange look on her face. She told me she had run into one of my cousins at the grocery store who had congratulated her on finally patching things up with Ryan. I stared at her confused. Apparently my mother had told the extended family that Ryan and I had reconciled and that he would indeed be attending the wedding. My cousin had even mentioned seeing him shopping for a suit. The realization hit me slowly and then all at once. My mother had decided to rewrite the story on her own terms. She was going to make this reunion happen whether I wanted it or not. That night I sat on the couch staring at the blank wall thinking about what to do next. I could feel the familiar ache of frustration rising again, the kind that comes when you realize your boundaries are just lines other people pretend not to see. Emma sat beside me quietly waiting for me to speak. I finally said that I needed to take control of this before it spiraled any further. The next day I would call the venue, confirm the guest list personally, and make sure no uninvited names had been added. I would not let my mother's wishful thinking turn into another wound I would spend years trying to heal. The next morning I called the venue manager to confirm our guest list. She sounded cheerful as she flipped through her notes, but when she reached the final page she hesitated for just a second too long. I knew before she even said it. Someone had sent an update to the list the previous evening adding 2 extra guests, one of them being my brother Ryan. My stomach tightened and I asked who had authorized the change. She told me it had come from an email address under my mother's name, and since the sender had referenced my wedding date and deposit details, they had assumed it was legitimate. I thanked her calmly and asked her to remove those names immediately. My voice was steady, but my hands trembled as I hung up. It was one thing for my mother to pressure me, but it was another thing entirely for her to start rewriting my plans behind my back. When Emma came into the kitchen, I was still staring at my phone trying to decide what to do next. She poured herself a cup of coffee and listened while I explained what had happened. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she placed her mug down softly and said that it was time I stopped reacting to my mother and started setting real consequences. She was right. For years, I had been trying to manage my family's emotions the same way my mother managed everyone else's, trying to keep the peace while quietly losing pieces of myself in the process. This time, I would not let that happen. I drove to my parents' house that afternoon. It had been months since I last stepped inside, and the moment I opened the front door, the smell of my mother's cooking hit me like a memory from another life. She came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel, her face lighting up in surprise before dimming again when she saw the look on mine. She asked if everything was all right, and I told her we needed to talk. She nodded warily and sat down at the table. I told her about the venue email, the updated list, the audacity of someone pretending to speak for me. She didn't even try to deny it. She said she had done it because she knew I would come to regret excluding Ryan, and that sometimes a parent has to step in when their child can't see what's best for them. I stood there in disbelief. The calm I had practiced before walking into that house began to crack. I told her that she had crossed a line and that if Ryan showed up at that wedding, I would have security remove him. I said it slowly, not as a threat but as a fact. Her face crumpled and she began to cry, telling me she had only done it out of love. I told her love does not mean forcing people into pain they have already healed from. She tried to reach for my hand, but I pulled away. I said that for once in my life I needed her to let me protect my peace. There was a long silence after that, one of those heavy pauses where even the air feels like it's holding its breath. Then she whispered that she just wanted her family back together. I told her we were never going to be the same family again, and pretending otherwise was making things worse. I left before she could respond. Driving home that evening, I felt both angry and strangely hollow. I kept thinking about how something as joyful as a wedding could turn into a battlefield of old wounds. When I got home, Emma was waiting on the porch, her expression worried but calm. I told her everything, and she wrapped her arms around me and said that sometimes peace looks like distance. I knew she was right again, though it didn't make it hurt any less. That night, we sat together going over final details for the wedding. We confirmed every vendor, every delivery, every name on the guest list. It felt meticulous and clinical, but it gave me a sense of control that I had been missing for weeks. 2 days later, I got an email from Ryan himself. The subject line simply said, "Let's talk." I almost deleted it unread, but something made me open it. He wrote that he'd heard about the argument with our mother and wanted to meet to clear the air. He said he didn't expect an invitation to the wedding but wanted to see me before it happened. He ended with a single line that made my chest tighten. He wrote, "I know I hurt you, and maybe I finally understand how much." For a long time I stared at that sentence, unsure how to feel. Was it genuine remorse or another attempt to absolve himself? Couldn't tell. I showed the email to Emma, and she told me I didn't owe him that conversation unless I truly wanted it. I told her I needed to think. That night, I lay awake turning it over in my mind. Part of me wanted to believe people could change, that after all these years maybe Ryan had grown enough to recognize the damage he had done. But another part of me remembered the smirk on his face when I confronted him all those years ago and the words he had said so easily. "Maybe you weren't enough for her." Those words still lived under my skin, and I couldn't let them back in. I decided not to respond. The next morning I received another call from my mother. Her tone was different this time, softer, quieter. She said she had spoken with Ryan and that he wanted to make amends before the wedding. I told her I had already seen his message and that I wasn't ready. She sighed and said she was worried I was letting pride get in the way of family. I told her pride had nothing to do with it. It was about self-respect. I could hear the disappointment in her silence, and I knew she still didn't understand. She ended the call by saying she hoped I would change my mind before the big day. I told her not to worry about it and hung up. That weekend, Emma and I went to the final venue walkthrough. The place looked beautiful, even half-finished, with tables stacked and flowers still in their boxes. For the first time, I could finally picture it, the laughter, the music, the light filtering through the tall windows. I realized that no matter what happened with my family, this moment was still ours. I wasn't going to let old ghosts steal it from me. As we walked out of the venue, my phone buzzed again. It was a text from an unknown number with only 5 words. "You'll regret freezing me out." I didn't need to ask who it was from. I could feel my heartbeat pick up as I stared at those words. For a brief second, I considered ignoring it, but something told me this wasn't over yet. When I read that message the first time, I thought it was just another petty attempt by Ryan to get under my skin, but something about the phrasing stuck with me. It was not angry or pleading or sarcastic. It was deliberate. "You will regret freezing me out." It sounded more like a promise than a threat. I showed it to Emma that evening, and she frowned but told me not to let it ruin my mood. We were only 4 days away from the wedding. The seating chart was final, the caterer was paid, and I was finally sleeping a little better. I deleted the message, told myself I would not give him the satisfaction of a reaction, and went on with the evening. The next day my mother called again. I almost did not answer, but guilt got the better of me. Her voice was composed but flat, like someone holding back tears or anger, I could not tell which. She said Ryan had decided not to attend and that he was planning to send a gift instead. She sounded relieved, as if this solved everything. I told her I appreciated her letting me know and that I hoped we could both just focus on the ceremony now. She hesitated, then said something that made my stomach tighten. She told me she hoped one day I would understand why she had pushed so hard for reconciliation, because she did not want me to live with regret. I said I already lived with regret, but none of it had to do with keeping my brother out of my wedding. She didn't reply. I think that was the moment she realized she could not change my mind. On the morning of the rehearsal dinner, the weather shifted. Clouds rolled in and the air smelled like rain. Emma was laughing with her bridesmaids at the venue while I was out front making sure the tables were covered. When I checked my phone again, I saw a missed call from an unknown number and a voicemail that made my heart drop. It was the venue manager saying there had been a mix-up with deliveries, and that someone claiming to be my brother had shown up insisting he was there to help set up for the wedding. She said he had mentioned my mother's name and told them I would be fine with it. She sounded uneasy and asked me to confirm. I told her immediately not to let him back on the property and that I would handle it. When I hung up, I stood there for a long time watching the rain gather in small puddles on the pavement, trying to make sense of what was happening. That evening, I called my mother again. I told her that Ryan had shown up at the venue and that she needed to make sure he stayed away. There was a pause before she spoke, and then she said she had no idea he had done that. I wanted to believe her, but the hesitation in her voice told me she knew more than she was saying. She tried to assure me he would not cause any more trouble, but I could hear the strain underneath her calm tone. I ended the call quickly and went to help Emma finish packing for the next day's setup. She noticed I was distracted and asked if I was okay. I told her everything was fine, but she could see through it. She just said softly that whatever happened, we would handle it together. That night, I barely slept. I kept picturing Ryan standing at the venue with that same easy confidence. He always had the same smirk that made every apology sound like a joke. I wondered what he wanted out of all this. Was he really trying to reconcile, or was he just looking for attention in the only way he knew how, by making himself the center of every story? The next morning, I went for a walk around sunrise, trying to clear my head. The city was quiet and the air still smelled like rain. I ended up outside a small cafe where I used to meet my father years ago before he passed. I sat down at one of the outdoor tables, and suddenly it hit me that my father would have hated all of this. He had been the calm one, the quiet balance to my mother's constant need to fix what could not be fixed. If he were alive, he would have told me to let go of what could not be repaired and focus on what was in front of me. So I did. I decided then that I would stop letting this situation dictate my mood. I would go to that wedding and be fully present with the people who truly cared. But the twist came that afternoon. I was back home helping Emma's brother unload some decorations when my mother showed up unannounced. Her eyes were red and she looked exhausted. She asked if we could talk alone, so we stepped out onto the porch. She told me something I never expected to hear. Ryan had not shown up at the venue out of spite. He had come because he was trying to deliver something for me. She said that after my letter, he had actually written one of his own, but had not sent it because he was ashamed. He had been holding on to it for days, trying to decide what to do. Apparently, he had confessed to her recently that he had been struggling for years with guilt and depression over what happened in college and had wanted to apologize in person but was too afraid I would turn him away. When she realized what he had been doing, she begged him not to show up uninvited, but he insisted on leaving the letter with the staff since he thought I would never read it otherwise. My mother said she had not told me because she was afraid it would upset me before the wedding. She handed me a small envelope with my name written in his handwriting. I stood there for a long time before opening it. Inside were just a few paragraphs written in his usual messy scrawl. He said he had spent years trying to justify what happened with Lauren, but the truth was there was no justification. He wrote that he had hated how easily I had walked away because it forced him to face what kind of person he really was. He said he envied the way I built a life from the wreckage while he kept making the same mistakes. He admitted he had tried to reach out several times, but each attempt had felt selfish, like he was doing it only to ease his conscience. The letter ended with one line that caught in my throat. He wrote, "I never wanted to be the villain in your story, but I suppose that is what I became, and I am sorry for every page of it." I didn't know how to feel reading that. Anger, sadness, confusion, all tangled together. For years I had told myself that Ryan felt nothing, that he had moved on without remorse. To see his guilt written out in ink felt like having a locked door suddenly swing open after years of silence. My mother watched me quietly and asked if I wanted to talk to him. I told her I didn't know. She said he had gone out of town to stay with a friend and wouldn't be back until after the wedding. I nodded and folded the letter back into the envelope. I told her she could come to the ceremony if she promised to let the past stay in the past for that one day. She agreed without hesitation. When she left, I sat on the porch alone, feeling something shift inside me. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but maybe it was the start of it. That night, Emma found me sitting there with the letter in my hands. She asked what it was, and I told her the truth. She didn't say much, just took my hand and said that sometimes closure looks different than we expect. I realized she was right. Maybe closure wasn't a perfect conversation or an apology that fixed everything. Maybe it was simply knowing that the other person finally saw the damage they caused. For the first time in years, I felt a quiet kind of relief settle over me. The morning of the wedding arrived quiet and overcast in that soft gray way that makes the world feel slower, as if everything is holding its breath before something important. Emma was calm, as always, going through her morning routine with the same grace she brought to everything. I could barely sit still. Every detail felt suddenly heavier, the tie that refused to sit straight, the cufflinks I kept dropping, the faint hum of rain against the window. I had barely slept, but it was not nerves about marrying her. It was the thought of what else the day might bring. The letter from Ryan had left a restlessness in me that would not go away. It had cracked something open, and now I could not decide if that was good or bad. When I arrived at the venue, the staff were already setting up chairs and lights. The air smelled of damp wood and fresh flowers. Guests began arriving slowly, and for a while I managed to lose myself in the movement of it all, the handshakes, the laughter, the distant sound of music tuning up. My mother arrived next, wearing a pale blue dress that matched the sky beginning to clear behind the trees. She smiled when she saw me, but there was something fragile about it. I noticed she was holding a small gift bag, and I guessed it was from Ryan. She hugged me lightly and whispered that she was proud of me. It felt genuine this time, not like the manipulative warmth I had grown used to. I thanked her and told her I was glad she came. The ceremony itself went beautifully. When Emma walked down the aisle, everything else blurred out: the crowd, the whispers, the faint creak of the floorboards beneath our feet. I remember only her face, the way her eyes softened when she looked at me. When the officiant asked if anyone objected to our union, a flash of dark humor crossed my mind as I half expected my brother to burst through the doors just to keep the pattern alive. But nothing happened. The only sound was the rustle of leaves outside and the low hum of the guests breathing as one. When we exchanged vows, I felt something lift off me that I had been carrying for years, like the moment when a storm finally breaks and the air clears. After the ceremony came the reception. The hall was full of light and laughter, and for the first time in weeks I was fully present. I shook hands, hugged friends, and even managed to enjoy my mother's attempts at small talk. When it was time for toasts, Emma's brother stood up and made everyone laugh so hard that even my mother wiped away tears. For a moment everything felt simple again. Then, as the music started and people began to dance, one of the servers came up to me, holding the small bag my mother had been carrying earlier. She said my mother had asked her to give it to me privately. Inside was a sealed envelope with my name on it, again in Ryan's handwriting. My heart skipped. I thought maybe it was another letter, but when I opened it, there was only a folded photograph and a note no longer than a sentence. The photo was of the three of us from years ago, me, Ryan, and our dad at the lake where we used to fish. On the back of it, he had written, "Don't wait until it's too late." I stood there staring at those words, feeling that familiar tightening in my chest. I didn't know what to make of it. Was he talking about forgiveness, or was it something else? I looked around the room, half expecting to see him in the crowd, but there was no sign of him. I slipped the photo back into the envelope and tucked it into my jacket pocket. Emma noticed my distraction and asked softly if everything was okay. I told her I was fine and that I would explain later. She didn't press. The evening went on, and by the time the music slowed to its last song, most of the guests had drifted outside to the patio. I followed them out into the cool night air. The rain had stopped completely and the clouds had cleared just enough for a few stars to peek through. I felt peaceful for the first time in what felt like forever. I thought maybe that was what Ryan had meant. Maybe he was just reminding me not to let bitterness follow me into the rest of my life. I could live with that interpretation. I reached into my jacket to look at the photo again, but it was gone. The envelope had fallen somewhere. I retraced my steps inside the hall, but it was nowhere to be found. I figured I must have dropped it while greeting guests. I told myself it didn't matter. The message was already burned into my mind. Later that night, when Emma and I finally got to our hotel, she fell asleep almost instantly, but I stayed awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the day in my head. My phone buzzed once with a new message. It was from an unknown number again. It read, "I'm glad you're happy. You deserve it. I hope you can forgive me someday." I knew immediately it was from Ryan. I typed back that I had read his letter and appreciated his words. I stopped short of saying I forgave him, but I told him I hoped he found peace too. Then I put the phone face down and finally slept. The next morning the world felt different. Sunlight poured through the window and everything smelled like coffee and clean linen. Emma was already awake, sitting by the window with her hair still messy from sleep, smiling at me. She said it was the best day of her life, and for once I believed I could say the same. While she packed, I scrolled through my phone and saw a missed call from my mother. Her message was short, but her voice trembled. She said she had just gotten news from one of Ryan's friends that he had been in an accident late last night while driving home from out of town. She said he hadn't survived. I sat there frozen. Emma turned when she saw my face and knew instantly something was wrong. I played the message for her and we sat in silence for a long time. The words from that photo echoed in my head over and over. Don't wait until it's too late. Grief does strange things to time. The morning after I learned about Ryan's accident stretched endlessly, as if the world had decided to move in slow motion just to make sure I felt every heartbeat and every breath. I sat at the edge of the bed, unable to move, staring at the light filtering through the curtains and thinking about that last message he had sent. "I am glad you are happy. You deserve it. I hope you can forgive me someday," kept looping through my mind until the words no longer made sense. Emma stayed beside me quietly, not trying to offer comfort or explanation, just existing there in that heavy silence. That was what I needed most. We drove to my mother's house later that day. The air was heavy and thick with the smell of rain and the faint scent of her perfume that always seemed to linger even outside. She was sitting at the dining table when we arrived, clutching a mug that had gone cold long ago. When she saw me, she stood up, but her legs seemed to forget how to move. I crossed the room and hugged her. It was the first time in years that she had let herself collapse against me. She kept saying she did not understand how it had happened, that he was supposed to be staying with a friend for the weekend, that he had only been on the road a short time before the crash. There was an investigation still ongoing, but the police believed it was just bad weather and poor visibility. He had lost control on a wet curve, and by the time anyone found him, it was too late. I did not cry at first. I think shock is its own kind of numbness that shields you until your mind catches up to your heart. I sat there listening to my mother talk in circles about how she wished she had stopped him from driving that night. Every time she said his name, her voice cracked, and I could see the guilt already taking root. She looked at me with tear-streaked eyes and whispered that he had been on his way back from buying a gift for me and Emma. I asked how she knew, and she said the police had found a small wrapped box in the passenger seat with my name written on it. She handed it to me carefully as though it might break. The paper was damp and torn at one edge, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Inside was a silver tie clip engraved with 3 small letters RED, my initials. Beneath it was a short note that read, "Thought you could use this on the big day anyway. Proud of you, little brother." I felt something inside me give way then. The tears came hard and fast, blurring everything. It wasn't the gift itself that undid me, but the realization that somewhere in those final hours, he had been thinking of me. All the anger and resentment I had been holding onto for years suddenly felt meaningless. I wished I had answered his message differently. I wished I had told him I forgave him even if I hadn't fully meant it yet. There are no second chances in moments like that. They just stop. You are left standing there trying to figure out what to do with the words you never got to say. The following days passed in a haze. There were arrangements to be made, phone calls to answer, condolences to receive. My mother seemed to age a decade overnight. She kept apologizing to me as though she were the one who had crashed that car. She said she had pushed too hard and that she should have left us both alone. I told her it wasn't her fault, but she didn't believe me. I could see the regret in her eyes every time she looked at me. She kept saying she just wanted her sons to be close again, and now she would give anything to take back the choices she had made. I didn't know how to respond, so I just told her I loved her, and that was enough to make her cry harder. At the funeral, I stood beside her as people I barely knew came up to shake my hand and tell me how sorry they were. Ryan's friends told stories about his charm and humor, about how he could make anyone laugh. I listened quietly, realizing that the version of him I had hated for so long was not the only version that had existed. He had been complicated, messy, selfish, yes, but also human. In the middle of the service, my mother reached for my hand and held it so tightly I could feel her pulse trembling through her fingers. When the pastor finished speaking, she leaned close and whispered that Ryan had written something else in his journal that she wanted me to read later. She said she had found it when she went through his apartment. That night, after everyone had gone home, she gave me the journal. It was worn leather with pages full of half-finished thoughts and old receipts tucked between them. Most of it was ordinary notes about his work, his car appointments, things like that. But near the back there was a page dated just a few days before he died. It said, "Sometimes I think about calling him just to hear his voice again, but I never know what to say that won't sound small compared to what I did. Maybe the only way to fix something is to stop pretending it's not broken. If I could tell him one thing, it would be that I never stopped wanting to be his brother." I read those lines over and over until the ink blurred from the tears that had fallen onto the page. For years I had been convinced that he didn't care. Now I knew he had cared more than I realized, but he just hadn't known how to show it. Maybe that was our curse as brothers, both too proud to admit we were hurting until it was too late. I closed the journal and sat there for a long time, feeling both empty and full at once. Emma came and sat beside me, resting her head on my shoulder without saying anything. Her presence grounded me in the moment, reminding me that life was still moving forward even if part of it had been frozen in place. Over the next week, I found myself thinking about Ryan constantly, not just about what had happened between us, but about who he had been before it all went wrong. I remembered the sound of his laugh, the way he used to whistle off-key when we were fishing, the way he'd toss me a baseball and say "heads up" before I was ready. Those memories hurt, but they also softened something in me. They reminded me that people are rarely defined by their worst moments. I began to understand that forgiveness wasn't really for the person who hurt you. It was for yourself, so you could stop carrying them like a weight around your neck. By the time we returned home from my mother's house, the world felt quieter. The tie clip sat on my dresser, catching the afternoon light, and I found myself touching it every morning before heading out the door. It had become a small reminder that peace doesn't always come in the way you expect. Sometimes it shows up wrapped in loss and forces you to decide what to do with it. The weeks after the funeral unfolded slowly, like a long breath I could not seem to release. My mother began calling me every morning, not to talk about plans or regrets, but just to hear my voice. At first her calls were short, awkward pauses filled with sentences that went nowhere, yet gradually they softened into real conversations. She asked about my job, my house, the trips Emma and I were planning, and sometimes about nothing at all. I could tell she was still carrying guilt, but she no longer tried to fix it by rewriting the past. Instead, she listened, and that small change felt enormous. One evening, when I stopped by her house, I noticed the photo of Ryan and me at the lake framed on her mantel. For the first time in years, I did not feel that dull stab of resentment when I looked at it. It felt almost peaceful to see us smiling there, frozen in a version of life that still held possibility. Emma handled those weeks with quiet strength. She never once pushed me to move on before I was ready, but she made sure I did not get lost in the weight of it all. She had this way of making space for grief without letting it consume the room. I remember one Saturday morning she came into the kitchen holding 2 mugs of coffee and said she had an idea. She wanted us to drive out to that same lake where the photo had been taken to leave something for Ryan. I hesitated at first, but then I realized it was exactly what I needed. So a week later we drove through winding roads that smelled of pine and rain until the water appeared through the trees just as I remembered it. The dock was still there, weathered and slightly tilted, but somehow untouched by time. We sat at the edge of it for a long time without speaking. I had brought the tie clip with me wrapped in a small cloth. I placed it gently on the wooden planks beside me and watched the light glint off the metal. It felt like a symbol of something both unfinished and forgiven. I told Emma about a memory from when we were kids, how Ryan had taught me to skip stones on this very shore. He always made it look effortless while mine would plop and sink immediately. He used to laugh and say that the trick was in the wrist, not the throw. That line came back to me as I picked up a flat stone and flicked it across the surface. It skipped once, twice, 3 times before sinking. I smiled without meaning to. Maybe I had finally learned what he was trying to teach me all along, about letting things move lightly across the surface instead of forcing them down. As we drove home, I felt a strange calm settle in. Grief no longer felt like something I had to wrestle with, but something that could sit quietly in the passenger seat beside me without demanding attention. When we got home, I called my mother to tell her about the trip. She cried softly, but it sounded different this time, lighter somehow. She said she had been sorting through some of Ryan's things and found an old voice message he had recorded on his phone but never sent. It was short, just him saying he hoped one day we could all have dinner again like old times. She told me she wanted me to have it and that she would send it over. When I played it later that night, I could hear his voice faintly over the background hum of traffic saying he missed me and hoped I was doing well. That was it. Simple. Unfinished. But somehow enough. Over the next few months, life began to return to its ordinary rhythm. Work deadlines reappeared, wedding photos arrived in the mail, and Emma and I started talking about taking a small trip to the coast before winter. Yet everything felt subtly different, as if the colors of the world had deepened just a little. I found myself appreciating small things more than before: the way morning light filtered through our living room curtains, the sound of rain on the roof, the way Emma hummed softly when she cooked. I realized that losing Ryan had stripped away a layer of pride I did not even know I still carried. It made me understand how fragile everything truly is, how quickly anger can turn into silence and silence into regret. One afternoon my mother came to visit, bringing an old family album. We sat on the couch flipping through photos I had not seen in years. There were birthdays, holidays, camping trips, all the small chapters that make up a family's story. Somewhere near the end was a photo I had never noticed before. It was of me and Ryan, maybe 8 and 10, sitting on the steps of our old house holding toy airplanes. On the back, in my father's handwriting, were the words "Brothers Learning How to Fly." I stared at that for a long time and then placed it back in the album. My mother smiled faintly and said that maybe he had been right, that we both just took different skies. For the first time I felt ready to agree. That night after she left, I sat outside on the porch with Emma, watching the sky darken into that deep blue just before night fully arrives. I thought about all the years I had spent angry, all the energy I had wasted trying to make sense of something that never really could be understood. In the end, forgiveness had not come from some grand revelation or dramatic apology. It had come quietly, like dusk slipping in without announcement. I realized that peace isn't something you win. It is something you allow. I stood up, stretched, and looked out at the fading horizon, thinking about Ryan, the lake, the note that said "Don't wait until it's too late." He had been right, even if he never meant for those words to become his final message. I walked back inside and turned off the lights, letting the house fill with the soft hum of evening. For the first time in years, I felt weightless, not because everything was fixed, but because I had finally stopped trying to fix it. That night, before falling asleep, I whispered a simple thank you into the quiet room, not to anyone in particular, just to the air that still held his memory. It felt like closing a chapter, without bitterness, without guilt, only a quiet acceptance that some stories do not end with neat resolutions. Some end with peace.